This is the story of one of the first civilizations on Earth, which went from the opium dens of colonial humiliation to becoming a world superpower in just 35 years. And yet the story that matters most, the story that explains everything that came after, the story that holds within it the secret of how a people can endure anything: drought, flood, conquest, collapse, fragmentation, invasion, and still remain recognizably themselves. That story does not begin in the 20th century, or the 19th, or even the 1st. It begins at the very edge of recorded memory, in a time before writing, before bronze, before kings, when the only authorities were rivers, and the only temples were the mountains, and the only prayers were the first careful seeds pressed into loosened earth by hands that had never done it before and had no way of knowing, could have had no way of knowing that what they were starting would still be continuing more than 10,000 years later. So let yourself settle now, wherever you are lying, and feel the weight of your body becoming something heavy and warm and still. Feel the places where your shoulders have been holding tension begin, very slowly, to soften, and feel your breath deepen just slightly, just naturally, because there is nothing you need to do right now except receive this story, and the story will come to you gently, the way all rivers eventually come to the sea, without hurry, without force, following the path of least resistance through a landscape that has been shaped over an unimaginable stretch of time, exactly to receive it. Close your eyes and let the world that was begin. Imagine the land as it existed before any of us had names for it, an enormous continental interior sealed on almost every side by the most formidable natural barriers the planet had yet devised. And you begin to understand something essential about the civilization that grew within those barriers, something about its character, its depth, its extraordinary capacity for self-reference and self-renewal. To the east, the Pacific Ocean laid itself out like a vast silver mirror, its surface barely disturbed by wind in the early morning, its waves arriving at the long curved coastline in long, patient rows, not violent, but inevitable, the way all great forces are inevitable. To the north, the Gobi Desert stretched in every direction, a sea of stone and dust and sand so inhospitable that crossing it was not merely difficult, but, for most of human history, effectively impossible for any large group of people carrying food and water and the goods of civilization. To the west, the Himalayas rose in a continuous wall of white, so high that the air above them was too thin to breathe comfortably, and the passes through them were so treacherous that they were known even in later centuries as places where the sky ended and the world of the gods began. And to the south, dense subtropical forest pressed in from multiple directions, a living wall of green so thick with vegetation and rainfall and insects and disease that penetrating it in significant numbers required a kind of determination that bordered on madness. Within all of this, sealed and sheltered and largely left to its own long devices, was a land of extraordinary diversity, of high plains and deep river valleys, of dry northern grassland and warm southern wetlands, of forests and deserts and mountain ranges and alluvial plains, so flat that standing at their center, you could see the curvature of the earth at the horizon. And through this land, like two great arteries, carrying the blood of a civilization that did not yet exist, ran the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south. Two rivers so different in character that they might have belonged to two separate continents, and yet together they created the environmental conditions for something that would become one of the longest continuous stories in human experience. The Yellow River earned its name from the color of its water, which was not blue or green or clear, but a murky, churned yellow-brown, thick with the fine, silty soil called loess that it carried from the high western plateaus, thousands of tons of it moving eastward every day, settling wherever the water slowed, building up the extraordinarily fertile riverbanks that would eventually support the first great northern civilizations. But the Yellow River was not gentle. It flooded with a frequency and a violence that made life along its banks a perpetual negotiation between abundance and catastrophe, between the richness that the river's silt deposited when it ran high and the absolute destruction it left behind when it broke its banks entirely, which it did with enough regularity that the people who chose to settle near it were making, consciously or not, a decision to live in relationship with something vastly more powerful than themselves, something that could give everything and take everything back in the space of a single season. And yet they stayed, generation after generation, because that fertile loess soil could grow millet in conditions that would defeat almost any other crop. And because once you have eaten well from a particular piece of earth, it becomes very difficult to leave it, even knowing that the river might one day reclaim it. Far to the south, the Yangtze moved through a completely different world, a warmer, wetter, more lushly vegetated landscape, where the air itself seemed heavier with moisture, where the winters were mild and the summers were long, and the light had a particular quality of diffusion that made everything look slightly softened at the edges, and where the conditions were perfect for something that would eventually become one of the most consequential crops in human history: rice. Not the wild grass from which it was eventually domesticated, but the carefully cultivated, intensively managed, endlessly patient crop that the people of the southern Yangtze Basin would spend thousands of years perfecting, learning to flood and drain their fields in precise rhythms, learning to build the intricate systems of channels and dikes that water management requires, learning to read the rains and the river levels the way navigators learn to read stars, until the cultivation of rice became not merely an agricultural practice, but a kind of annual collaboration between human intelligence and the generosity of water. These two rivers, these two crops, this one land sealed within its natural barriers. This was the stage. And the first actors to walk onto it were people who had been walking for a very long time. People whose ancestors had made the long journey from the African continent tens of thousands of years before, who had moved across Central Asia, following game and water and the slow seasonal rhythms of a world without agriculture, and who had gradually, over many generations, found their way into this sheltered interior and begun to settle it, layer by layer, the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water, each generation pressing more deeply into the landscape, learning its particularities, adapting their tools and their bodies and their habits of mind to its specific demands, until they were no longer visitors passing through, but inhabitants, deeply shaped by the land they inhabited. The archaeological record of this deep prehistoric time is fragmentary, as all such records are, composed of objects that survived not because they were important, but because they were made of materials that do not decay quickly: stone, bone, fired clay, and because they happened to end up in places where the conditions of burial preserved them rather than destroying them, which means that what we know about the first 100,000 years of human presence in this landscape is partial and probabilistic and constantly being revised as new sites are excavated, new methods of dating are developed, new interpretive frameworks allow us to see in old evidence things that previous generations of scholars could not. What we can say with confidence is that people were here, that they made tools from stone with increasing sophistication, that they controlled fire, that they moved in groups small enough to live off the land's natural productivity, following the seasonal movements of the animals they hunted and the cycles of the plants they gathered, and that they were, in all the ways that matter most, fully human, curious, social, capable of learning and teaching and passing knowledge from one generation to the next through the medium of direct demonstration and oral memory. And then, around 10,000 years ago, something changed. Not suddenly, not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but slowly, the way most truly important things change, through the gradual accumulation of small observations and small experiments and small successes that over time added up to a transformation so complete that it is difficult to overstate its significance. People began to plant. They took seeds from the grasses they had been gathering for generations and pressed them into the earth near their seasonal camps. And they waited. And when the plants grew in the same spot the following season, they began to understand that the earth could be made to cooperate with human intention in a way that nothing before had ever suggested was possible. This was the Neolithic Revolution, and it was not a revolution in the conventional sense of the word, not a sudden overthrow of the old order, but a slow, patient, generational realization that the world was more malleable than it had appeared, and that the relationship between human beings and their environment was not fixed, but negotiable, and that negotiating it skillfully was the beginning of everything we would eventually call civilization. In the north, along the middle reaches of the Yellow River, the crop that first yielded itself to cultivation was millet, a small seeded grass that was almost perfectly suited to the conditions of the region, tolerant of drought, capable of growing in the thin, lowest soils that lined the river valleys, productive enough in good years to generate a surplus above what the farmers needed to eat, which is to say that millet was not merely a food source, but a civilizational engine, because the surplus it generated was the material basis for everything that came next, for the specialization of labor and the growth of trade and the emergence of social hierarchy and the construction of the first permanent settlements, that would eventually evolve into the first cities. Communities that planted millet in the north built their first year-round villages near water, replacing the seasonal camps of their hunting and gathering ancestors with structures that were meant to last. Low rectangular houses of wood and wattle and clay, their floors pressed smooth, their roofs thatched against the rain, their interiors organized around hearths and storage pits in ways that tell us, even from the archaeological evidence of their floors and post holes, something about how the people who lived in them organized their time and their relationships with one another. In the south, along the Yangtze and its many tributaries, the transformation was happening simultaneously, but along a different track, because the crop that the southern communities were learning to cultivate was not millet but rice. And rice is a completely different kind of crop with a completely different set of demands and a completely different set of rewards. And adapting a human community to the cultivation of rice required a kind of collective intelligence and cooperative labor organization that millet farming did not demand in quite the same way. Rice needs water, standing water, water that must be introduced and controlled, and then drained at precisely the right moments in the plant's growth cycle, which means that growing rice requires not just individual effort, but coordinated community effort, the construction and maintenance of shared infrastructure, channels, dikes, paddies, that no single family or household could build or manage alone, and that required the development of social mechanisms for coordinating labor, resolving disputes about water rights, making collective decisions about timing and maintenance, all of which laid the groundwork for the particular forms of social organization that would come to characterize the southern regions of China and distinguish them even today in subtle but measurable ways from the north. The divergence between the millet farming north and the rice cultivating south was not merely agricultural but ecological, economic, social, and eventually cultural, creating regional distinctions that persisted for thousands of years and can still be traced in transformed and attenuated form in the present day, in differences in diet and architecture and dialect and certain habits of social organization that have proven remarkably resistant to the homogenizing forces of centralized imperial rule and modern communication technology. But in the deep Neolithic, these two agricultural traditions were not yet in dialogue with each other. They were developing in relative isolation, each one generating its own surplus, each one producing its own social complexity, each one generating out of the simple act of planting and harvesting and storing food the conditions for something larger and more intricate than any of the people living within those conditions could have imagined or intended. Across many centuries, as the agricultural villages of both North and South grew larger and more organized, something began to emerge from the logic of surplus itself, something that would prove to be both a tremendous creative force and a source of enduring conflict and inequality, and that thing was hierarchy. When there is more food than the immediate group needs to survive, someone must decide how to store it, how to distribute it, how to use it to sustain the community through lean seasons and bad harvests. And the person or group of people who control those decisions acquire, in the process, a form of power that is different in kind from the authority of a skilled hunter or a wise elder, because it is structural rather than personal, rooted not in individual ability, but in institutional position, and it tends, once established, to reproduce itself across generations in ways that hunting skill and wisdom do not. The children of those who control the granary inherit the granary. The families of those who manage the surplus again. And over time, what began as a practical arrangement becomes a social reality, and the social reality becomes a moral framework, and the moral framework becomes, eventually, a cosmology in which the existing hierarchy reflects not merely human convenience, but divine or cosmic intention. There is a village that archaeologists excavated in the 20th century, a place called Banpo near the Yellow River. And what they found there has become one of the most evocative windows into the early Neolithic world of northern China. A world that was already, 6,000 years ago, more organized and more socially complex than the simple image of prehistoric life might suggest. Banpo was not a camp or a collection of temporary shelters. It was a planned community, laid out with evident intentionality, with residential zones and communal spaces and specialized work areas and a defensive ditch dug around the entire perimeter, which tells us that the people of Banpo were not only farming and building houses, but were also thinking defensively about their territory, understanding it as something worth protecting from whatever or whoever might threaten it. The houses were organized in groups, suggesting extended family clusters, and the community building at the center of the settlement was large enough to hold the entire village population, which suggests that there were occasions, ceremonies, meetings, collective decisions, when the whole community needed to come together in one place, which in turn suggests a level of social cohesion and collective identity that goes well beyond simple cohabitation. But what makes Banpo most extraordinary, what transforms it from an interesting archaeological site into something that feels, across the enormous distance of 6 millennia, genuinely moving, is the pottery. Because the people of Banpo made pottery that was not merely functional, but beautiful, painted in red and black with geometric patterns and stylized animal forms, with fish and human faces and spirals and interlocking shapes of a complexity that required not just manual skill, but genuine artistic imagination, a capacity for abstraction and symbolic representation that is one of the most distinctively human abilities we possess. And the fact that people were exercising this capacity at Banpo 6,000 years ago, that they were making pots that did not need to be beautiful, but were made beautiful anyway, through the deliberate application of skill and aesthetic judgment, and the willingness to spend additional time and effort on an object simply to make it more pleasing to look at. This tells us something that no amount of tool analysis or dietary reconstruction can tell us. It tells us that these were people for whom beauty mattered, for whom the visible world was not merely a collection of practical problems to be solved, but a space of potential meaning and elegance, and that the impulse to make things beautiful was not a luxury or an afterthought, but as fundamental to their humanity as the impulse to eat or to build or to protect themselves from the cold. The pottery of later Neolithic cultures built on what Banpo had begun, and here the archaeological record becomes almost dizzyingly rich, because the two great cultural traditions of the later Neolithic, the Yangtze culture of the north and the Longshan culture that eventually spread across a much wider area, are distinguished from each other in large part by the extraordinary quality and distinctiveness of their ceramics. And these ceramics tell us things about the societies that produced them that we could not know from any other source. The Yangtze potters made vessels of red and orange clay, painted with swirling designs of such technical sophistication that when they were first excavated in the 20th century, Western archaeologists initially refused to believe they could be prehistoric, assuming they must be more recent forgeries, because the painted decoration was simply too good, too controlled, too aesthetically assured to fit within their existing assumptions about what prehistoric people were capable of. The Longshan potters went in a completely different direction, producing vessels of extraordinary thinness. The walls of some Longshan pots are barely 2 millimeters thick, in a glossy black that was achieved through a carefully controlled firing process. Vessels so thin and so dark and so perfectly formed that they look, even today, as if they could have been made yesterday in a contemporary studio. And that required a mastery of the entire ceramic process, from clay preparation through firing, that rivals anything produced in later, supposedly more sophisticated periods. These are not just pots. They are evidence of societies with enough surplus to support specialized craft people who spent years developing skills that went far beyond what any individual farmer could develop alongside the ordinary demands of agricultural life. They are evidence of trade networks that moved finished goods and raw materials across significant distances. They are evidence of emerging distinctions between communities, because the particular style of a vessel's decoration could mark its community of origin the way a flag marks a nation. And they are evidence, in the most exquisite and intimate way possible, of the human desire to make the world more beautiful than it strictly needs to be, a desire that runs through all of Chinese artistic production, from these first Neolithic pots to the blue and white porcelain of the Ming Dynasty, to the calligraphy that Chinese scholars and artists still practice with the same intensity and reverence today. As the Neolithic villages grew into larger settlements, and the larger settlements developed toward something that begins to look, however remotely, like proto-urban complexity, the stories that people told about their origins and their obligations and the nature of the world they inhabited began to take on new importance, because large, stratified, complex societies need shared narratives in ways that small, egalitarian communities do not. And the narratives that the people of early China developed to explain their own existence and to establish the moral foundations of their social order were among the richest and most enduring that any human culture has ever produced. These were the stories of the 5 emperors, the legendary sage kings of remote antiquity, and they are not historical records in any conventional sense. They are moral architectures, structures of value and aspiration, given human form, made into stories, because stories are how human beings understand and transmit and remember the things that matter most to them. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, stands at the head of this legendary tradition, and what is attributed to him tells us everything we need to know about what the culture that created these stories considered most important, because Huangdi is credited not with military conquest, or the accumulation of wealth, or the subjugation of rival peoples, but with the invention and teaching of the fundamental technologies and practices of civilized life, the domestication of silkworms and the weaving of silk, the creation of the calendar that would align human activity with the rhythms of the seasons, the development of writing and mathematics and music and medicine, and the establishment of proper social relationships between rulers and subjects, between parents and children, between husbands and wives, not as impositions from above, but as reflections of a natural order that already existed in the cosmos, and that human beings had the capacity and the responsibility to understand and embody. A ruler in this tradition derives his authority not from his military power, or his lineage, or his ability to force compliance, but from his capacity to understand and align himself with the patterns of the natural and moral universe, to be, in his own person and in his governance, a living expression of the order that heaven intended. And this idea, so different from the brute force theories of political authority that have prevailed in many other cultural traditions, would prove to be one of the most distinctive and enduring contributions of Chinese civilization to the broader human conversation about how power should be exercised and what legitimacy means. Then there was Yao, whose story is perhaps the most poignant and the most radical of all the legendary rulers, because what Yao is remembered for is not what he built or what he conquered or what he created, but for what he chose not to do, for the act of renunciation that the tradition presents as the highest possible expression of both personal virtue and political wisdom. Yao was a great ruler, a ruler under whose governance the realm prospered, and the people were content. And when the time came for him to pass the authority on, he had a son, as all fathers do, and his son was there, available and willing. And passing power to one's son was not merely convenient, but in most cultures and most periods of human history, simply what one did, the natural extension of the paternal bond into the political realm. But Yao looked at his son, and he looked at the realm, and he understood something that very few people in his position have ever had the clarity and the courage to act on, which is that his son was not the right person for the responsibility, and that the well-being of the thousands of people whose lives depended on the quality of the next ruler's governance mattered more than any personal preference or familial loyalty. And so he searched the realm for the most virtuous person he could find, and he found Shun. Shun was a farmer's son, not royal, not wealthy, not connected to any of the great families whose members would normally have been considered candidates for the highest authority. And yet everywhere that Shun had lived and worked, something remarkable had happened around him. A kind of moral gravity that drew out the best in the people nearby, so that farmers who worked near him gave him their best land without being asked, and fishermen on the same river as him moved their lines to give him the most productive positions. And in every village where he had lived, disputes between neighbors had a way of quietly resolving themselves, not because Shun intervened or judged, but simply because his presence seemed to remind people of what they already knew about how to treat each other well. Yao recognized this quality in Shun, not as magic, but as character, as the practical manifestation of a moral development so thorough and so genuine that it had become, in Shun, simply the way he moved through the world, effortlessly and without calculation, producing harmony wherever he went. And Yao gave Shun the greatest gift any ruler can give, which is not wealth or power, but genuine responsibility, the burden and the privilege of being accountable for the well-being of others. And Shun carried that responsibility as exactly what it was, a gift rather than an entitlement for the rest of his life. When the time came for Shun to pass the responsibility on, he did not give it to his son either. He gave it to a man named Yu, a man who had done something so practically extraordinary that the memory of it would echo through Chinese civilization for more than 3,000 years, who had looked at the Yellow River flooding across the northern plains, drowning crops and destroying villages and killing people who had done nothing to deserve it, and had decided not to fight the water because no one can fight water, but to understand it, to spend years walking the length of the flood zone, mapping the paths that the water wanted to take, digging channels that gave it those paths, redirecting its energy rather than blocking it, working with the nature of the river rather than against it, in a way that was not merely effective as flood control, but was in the minds of everyone who came after a model of how intelligent and virtuous governance actually worked, not through force, but through understanding, not through domination, but through alignment with the nature of things. You spent 13 years in this work, and the tradition records that in those 13 years he passed his own home 3 times and heard through the walls the voices of his wife and his children, and did not stop, because the work was not finished, and it was not his work alone, but work done in service of something larger than himself. And it was this quality of service, uncoerced, unglamorous, requiring the sacrifice of personal pleasure for the sake of collective benefit, that the tradition held up as the highest expression of the kind of character that governance required. Yu's success was so complete, and his character so universally recognized, that the succession to him was inevitable, and he became the founder of the first hereditary dynasty in Chinese traditional history, the Jia, which is traditionally dated from roughly 2070 BC, and which marks a transition from the era of the sage kings, chosen for their virtue, to the era of dynasties in which power was transmitted within a family line. And with that transition came one of the enduring tensions of Chinese political thought, the tension between the hereditary principle, which said that the son of a good ruler had the right to succeed him, and the meritocratic principle, which said that the most capable and virtuous person should govern regardless of their birth, a tension that was never fully resolved, and perhaps never can be fully resolved because it reflects a genuine conflict between two different theories of how legitimacy works and what social stability requires. And the fact that this tension was built into Chinese political culture from the very beginning, inscribed in the foundational story of the first dynasty through the contrast between Yu's appointment by virtue and his son's succession by birth, meant that it would never be far from the surface of Chinese political discourse in any subsequent period. What archaeology can tell us about the Xia is limited and contested, because the written records of the Xia come from centuries later and were composed by people who had strong ideological reasons to present the Xia in particular ways, and the material evidence is difficult to match to the textual tradition with any certainty. But there is a site in the Middle Yellow River Valley called Early II, dated to roughly the right period, that gives us a glimpse of what early state formation in this region actually looked like. And it is striking in its combination of the familiar and the unexpected. Early II was not a village. It was a center, a place of concentrated power and specialized production on a scale that had no precedent in the Neolithic settlements that preceded it, with a palatial complex at its core that required an enormous investment of organized labor to build, with workshops producing bronze objects of a quality and technical sophistication that tells us immediately that the people doing this work had been practicing for a long time, had accumulated the knowledge of raw material sources and smelting techniques and casting methods that could not be improvised in a single generation, had in fact inherited and built upon a tradition of technical expertise that went back much further than the objects we can actually recover. Bronze. The word alone carries the weight of a revolution, not merely a technological revolution, but a social and political and ritual revolution, because bronze is not merely a harder and more durable material than stone, not merely a more effective medium for making tools and weapons, but the first material in human history whose production required the combination of resources, copper and tin, that were rarely found in the same place, whose extraction and smelting required specialized knowledge that could not be possessed by everyone, and whose finished products were therefore scarce enough and valuable enough and difficult enough to make that control over their production was itself a form of power. The person or institution that controlled bronze controlled something that everyone needed and few could obtain independently, and this control created, or rather amplified and formalized, the hierarchical structures that agricultural surplus had begun to put in place, drawing the bonds of elite authority tighter by making ordinary people dependent on those at the top of the social order, not merely for access to stored food, but for access to the tools and weapons that were increasingly necessary for both agriculture and warfare. Bronze vessels, the ritual objects produced in such extraordinary quantities and with such extraordinary artistry by the early state centers of the Middle Yellow River Valley, were not decorations. They were political objects, objects whose possession marked the possessor as someone who had access to the networks of production and exchange that the state controlled, and whose use in ritual ceremonies of ancestral sacrifice that were the central religious practice of the period, simultaneously performed and reinforced the authority of those who possessed them. The Shang dynasty, which succeeded the Zhou, and which is the first Chinese dynasty for which we have contemporary written documentation, brought this fusion of bronze, ritual, and political authority to its highest and most elaborate expression. And what it created was a world of such concentrated power and such extraordinary artistic production and such intimate entanglement of the political and the sacred that it requires a real effort of historical imagination to see it clearly, rather than through the distorting lens of later moral categories that tend to emphasize its violence at the expense of its genuine creativity. The great Shang centers, Zhou in the early period, Anyang in the late, were cities in a sense that goes well beyond the Erlito complex. Cities with massive rammed earth walls that would have required millions of person-days of labor to construct, with palace temple complexes at their cores that combined the functions of administrative center, ritual space, and royal residence, with workshop districts where bronze casters and jade carvers and bone workers practiced their specialized arts in a level of concentration that speaks to both the scale of elite demand for these objects and the degree of organization required to supply it. The bronzes produced in the Shang workshops are among the most technically and artistically extraordinary objects created anywhere in the ancient world, and it is worth pausing with them for a moment, trying to see them not as museum objects, frozen in glass cases, but as living artifacts, objects of power and meaning in a world where the boundary between the political and the sacred was not yet clearly drawn. The Shang bronze casters worked in a tradition that used piece mold casting rather than the lost wax method employed in many other ancient bronze casting traditions, a method that produced a distinctive aesthetic of crisp, precisely defined surfaces covered with dense, intricate decoration, and they achieved within that tradition a level of technical control that has never been surpassed and is difficult even to fully replicate with modern equipment, because the knowledge required to manage the entire process from raw material to finished object was accumulated over generations and resided in the bodies and memories of practitioners who spent their entire working lives within a single tradition. The animals that stare from the surfaces of Shang vessels, the Taoti masks, the dragons, the birds, the composite creatures that seem to be made from the parts of multiple real and imaginary animals, are not merely decorative motifs. They are, scholars believe, representations of the spirit world, of the ancestors and supernatural forces that the Shang king was in communication with through the ritual use of these vessels, a visual vocabulary of the sacred that was as precise and as meaningful to its original audience as the vocabulary of Christian iconography would be to a medieval European. The king stood at the center of this sacred world, and his authority was of a kind that is difficult for modern minds to fully grasp because it depended not on any form of public consent or legal framework, but on the claim apparently widely believed and apparently sincerely held by the kings themselves, that he alone could communicate directly with the royal ancestors and, through them, with Dai, the supreme deity who presided over the Shang cosmos, and that this communication was not merely a metaphor or a political fiction, but an actual practice with actual techniques and actual stakes. Stakes that were nothing less than the well-being of the realm and all who lived within it. The oracle bones, those extraordinary objects that give us our first window into the Shang mind, those flat turtle plastrons and ox shoulder blades that were heated until they cracked, and whose cracks were then read as messages from the divine, tell us in their very existence something profound about the Shang worldview, which is that the future was not opaque, that it was possible to ask questions of the cosmos and receive answers, that the gap between the human world and the world of the ancestors and spirits was not unbridgeable, but could be crossed through the right techniques, performed by the right person at the right moment, and that this crossing was not merely spiritually significant, but was a political necessity, the foundation upon which all other aspects of royal authority rested, because a king who could not speak to the ancestors could not know the will of heaven, and a king who did not know the will of heaven had no legitimate basis for the decisions he was required to make every day on behalf of the realm. The questions inscribed on the oracle bones are both grand and intimate, which is itself a kind of revelation, because the combination tells us that the Shang king was understood to be responsible for everything, for the outcome of military campaigns and the success of harvests and the timing of ritual sacrifices, but also for the weather in the royal domain and the health of the queen and the sex of an unborn child and the outcome of a royal hunting expedition. And all of these questions were addressed to the same divine apparatus with the same seriousness and the same expectation of a meaningful response. Because in the Shang world, the distinction between the cosmically significant and the personally important had not yet been clearly drawn, or perhaps more accurately, everything that touched the king's life was cosmically significant, precisely because the king was the pivot point around which the entire cosmic order turned, and any disruption to his well-being or his plans was therefore a disruption to the order of the universe itself. The scribes who recorded the questions and their interpretations were not merely bureaucratic functionaries, but participants in a sacred practice, people whose work put them in close proximity to the most powerful ritual technology available in the Shang world, and whose accumulated records constituted, over the generations, a kind of institutional memory of the cosmos's responses to human questions that was itself a form of power and knowledge. Writing emerged from this ritual context, not as a neutral technology for recording information, but as a sacred practice, a way of making the invisible visible, of capturing in permanent form the ephemeral crack of a heated bone and the interpretation that the crack produced. And it is worth reflecting on what it means that the oldest substantial body of Chinese writing is a record of conversations with the dead, a record of questions asked of ancestors and answered by heaven through the medium of cracked bone, because because this origin shapes everything that follows, gives to Chinese writing from its very beginning a quality of seriousness and ceremony that has never entirely left it, so that even today, even in the age of digital communication and social media, the act of writing in Chinese carries within it some residue of that original sacred weight, some memory of the scribes of Anyang pressing their bronze tools into the surface of turtle shells while the king waited for the answer that would determine whether the harvest would be good, whether the campaign would succeed, whether the dynasty would endure. The Shang dynasty did not endure forever, because nothing does, and the story of its ending is in some ways the most important story in all of early Chinese history, not because of the drama of the ending itself, though the drama is real enough. The last Shang king burning in his treasury as the Zhou forces entered the capital, the dynasty that had seemed as permanent as the Yellow River, suddenly gone in the space of a single battle. But because of the interpretation that the Zhou placed on that ending, the intellectual framework they constructed around it to explain what had happened and to justify their own seizure of power, an interpretation so elegant and so morally powerful and so perfectly suited to the political realities of a world where no military force is strong enough to maintain its position indefinitely, that it became the foundational political idea of Chinese civilization, the concept without which none of the succeeding centuries can be properly understood, the mandate of heaven. The logic of the mandate is simple enough to state and profound enough to spend a lifetime exploring, and it begins with a cosmological claim that was, in the ancient world, neither obvious nor universally accepted. The claim that heaven, not a personal deity with human emotions and preferences, but a cosmic moral principle, something closer to what we might call the natural order or the structure of ethical reality, cares about the well-being of the people who live under a given ruler's governance, and that this caring takes the form of a kind of political attentiveness, a watching of how rulers behave, a responding to what it sees, granting its support to rulers who govern virtuously and withdrawing that support from rulers who govern badly. When heaven withdraws its support, the withdrawal is not invisible, but is manifested in the physical world through a series of signs, floods, and droughts, and famines, and earthquakes, and the appearance of comets, and the rebellion of previously loyal subjects, all of which serve as warnings to the ruler that he has lost his way, that the cosmos has registered its judgment, and that if he does not reform himself and his governance, the final withdrawal of heaven's support, the fall of the dynasty, is only a matter of time. And when that fall comes, when a new force arises and defeats the old dynasty in battle, this is not mere military conquest. It is the visible expression of heaven's judgment, the physical confirmation of a moral reality that had already been established in the cosmic realm. And the new ruler, therefore, does not need to justify his seizure of power purely in military terms, but can claim, with genuine moral force, that what he has done is not usurpation, but restoration, not the overthrow of a legitimate authority, but the replacement of an authority that had already lost its legitimacy by failing the people in whose name it was exercised. This was the political framework that the Zhou applied to their conquest of the Shang, and it worked politically, intellectually, morally, in ways that pure military justifications never could, because it acknowledged the reality of dynastic change without celebrating brute force, because it made moral behavior a practical political necessity rather than a pious aspiration, because it provided a mechanism for distinguishing between legitimate rebellion against a genuinely corrupt ruler and mere self-interested insurrection, and because it offered ordinary people a way of understanding why terrible things happened to them, why the floods came and the crops failed, and the king's armies ravaged their villages. That did not reduce entirely to the arbitrary cruelty of the powerful, but situated their suffering within a larger moral narrative in which things would eventually, inevitably, be set right. The mandate of heaven became, and remained for the next 3,000 years, the central concept of Chinese political culture, the framework within which every dynasty justified its existence, and every rebellion justified its challenge. The idea that no ruler could escape because it was built into the very concept of rulership itself, and that no people could be entirely crushed by because it offered them, however distant and theoretical, the assurance that heaven was watching and that endurance was not pointless. The Zhou, who carried this idea into history, were not a simple or unsophisticated people, and the civilization they built on the ruins of the Shang was not a repudiation of what the Shang had created, but a transformation of it, a careful and deliberate incorporation of the most valuable elements of the preceding civilization into a new political and cultural framework, because the Zhou were sophisticated enough to understand that the people they had conquered had created things of genuine value that it would be foolish to destroy, and that the most effective form of conquest is not the demolition of the old order, but its absorption into the new one, so that the conquered people find themselves living in a world that is partly continuous with what they have always known, while being organized around new principles of authority and legitimacy. The Zhou adopted Shang bronze working techniques and ritual vessel forms. They continued the practice of divination and maintained many of the ritual practices that the Shang had developed. They preserved and studied the written records that the Shang scribes had created. And they built on top of all of this a new political and social order of remarkable sophistication, the enfeoffment system, in which the conquered territory was divided among the members of the Zhou royal family, allied noble families, and even some surviving Shang elites, each of whom received a grant of territory and the right to govern it in exchange for loyalty to the Zhou king, military service when called upon, and the performance of rituals that acknowledged Zhou supremacy over the realm. This system worked because of the intensity and the pervasiveness of the ritual culture that bound it together, and it is impossible to understand the Western Zhou period without understanding how central ritual was to every aspect of its social and political life. Not ritual as empty performance or social convention, but ritual as the living code of a civilization's self-understanding, as the daily practice through which people at every level of the social hierarchy enacted and reaffirmed their understanding of their place in the cosmic and social order. When a Zhou lord visited the royal court and performed the prescribed obeisances in the prescribed manner, using the prescribed vessels and speaking the prescribed words, he was not merely submitting to a political superior. He was participating in a ceremony through which the entire structure of heaven and earth and human society was reenacted and reconfirmed. A ceremony in which his submission was not humiliation, but an act of cosmic alignment, a statement that he understood and accepted the shape of the universe as heaven had ordained it, and that his governance of his own territory was an extension of that understanding, rather than a departure from it. The bronze vessels that the king presented to loyal lords as marks of favor were not gifts in the modern sense. They were simultaneously political documents, religious objects, and artistic masterpieces, objects whose inscriptions recorded the circumstances of their bestowal and whose physical form enacted in metal the hierarchical relationships that defined the Zhou order. Under the Zhou, a class of people began to emerge who would eventually become the most distinctive and arguably the most consequential product of Chinese civilization's long experiment with the question of how to govern a complex society well. The class known as the Shai, who began as lower-level aristocratic retainers, minor military men, and estate managers and administrative functionaries serving the great lords of the enfeoffment system, but who gradually became something more than that as the complexity of governance increased and the need for educated, capable people who could read and write and manage accounts and conduct diplomacy and understand the ritual traditions began to outpace the supply of people with hereditary claims to those positions. The Shai were learners, people who understood that their advancement depended not on their birth but on their mastery of a body of knowledge and a set of skills that could be studied and acquired and demonstrated. And this understanding, that education and merit could be the basis of social advancement and political authority, would become one of the most powerful and most contested ideas in all of subsequent Chinese history. The idea that would eventually be institutionalized in the famous examination system through which the imperial government selected its officials for more than 1,000 years. The idea that still shapes in transformed and attenuated form the extraordinary emphasis on education that characterizes Chinese and Chinese-derived cultures around the world today. The texts that the Shai studied, that they transmitted and commented on and argued about and built their intellectual lives around, were not dry administrative manuals, but genuinely profound engagements with the deepest questions of human social existence, and the tradition of reading and interpreting them generated over the centuries of the Zhou period. Some of the most original and consequential thinking about ethics and governance and the nature of human relationships that any civilization has ever produced. The Book of Documents preserved records, genuine and legendary, of the great sage kings and their pronouncements, teaching by example the qualities that virtuous governance required. The book of poetry collected over 300 poems spanning the full range of human experience, from courtly ceremony to agricultural labor, to romantic longing to military campaign, teaching by immersion the emotional and linguistic richness that a fully cultivated person was expected to possess. The Book of Changes offered a system for understanding the patterns of transformation that underlie all phenomena, teaching a kind of structural attentiveness to the dynamics of change that was as applicable to political situations as to personal ones. And woven through all of these texts was the concept of Li, ritual propriety, which was not merely a code of etiquette, but a vision of what a well-ordered human world looked like from the inside. A world in which every relationship was clearly defined, and every person understood both what they owed to others and what others owed to them. A world in which the daily practices of courtesy and ceremony were not superficial conventions, but the ongoing practical maintenance of the moral fabric that held society together. But the Zhou order, for all its beauty and sophistication, carried within it, from the very beginning, the seeds of its own eventual dissolution. And the dissolution, when it came, was not sudden, but glacial, a process that unfolded across generations in ways that were visible in retrospect, but nearly invisible in real time. The slow erosion of the personal bonds and shared cultural commitments that held the enfeoffment system together, the gradual replacement of genuine loyalty with formal compliance, and eventually with barely disguised autonomy, as the lords of the outer territories built up their own military and economic resources, developed their own distinct cultural identities, and began to find that the obligations they owed to the distant Zhou court were more burden than benefit, more constraint than protection. The population of a given territory began to identify with that territory, rather than with the Zhou realm as a whole, to think of themselves as people of Qi or of Chu, rather than as subjects of the Son of Heaven. And as this local identity strengthened, the pull of the center weakened, and the rituals that had once expressed genuine cosmic alignment began to feel, to those performing them, more like political theater than genuine self-expression, which in the world of Zhou ritual was tantamount to the collapse of the entire system, because ritual that is not sincerely meant is not ritual, but mockery, and mockery of the cosmic order was precisely the sign that the mandate was slipping. The end came in 771 BC in the reign of King Yu, whose story the tradition has shaped into something almost parable-like in its clarity of moral instruction, a story of personal weakness and political irresponsibility, expressed through the misuse of the one instrument that represented the last remaining power of the Zhou royal house, the beacon fires, those towers of light visible for miles across the northern plain, designed to summon the lords and their armies to the defense of the capital in the event of attack, and which King Yu lit not for any genuine emergency, but to amuse a court consort who rarely smiled, so that when the lords came racing from their territories with their armies, they found nothing, no enemy, no emergency, only a king and his favorite. And the sight of Baozi finally laughing at the spectacle of all those soldiers rushing for nothing. And the lords went home furious. And when the real emergency came, when the actual enemies appeared on the horizon, and the fires were lit again, the lords did not come, because they had decided, on the basis of their own experience, that the fires could not be trusted, and the capital fell, and King Yu died, and the Zhou court fled east with its rituals, and its texts, and its reduced authority to the city of Luoyang. And nothing was ever quite the same again. And yet something survived. Something essential. Something that proved more durable than any dynasty or any political system. Something that the rivers themselves might have recognized, persisting through the constant changes of the surface while maintaining its own deep character beneath. The writing survived. The ritual traditions survived. The philosophical frameworks survived. The texts survived. The memory of what a well-ordered civilization could be and should be survived, and not merely survived but became, in the centuries of political fragmentation that followed the fall of Western Zhou, the subject of the most intense and creative intellectual engagement in Chinese history, as thinkers of every kind grappled with the question of what had gone wrong and how it could be set right, and produced in the course of that grappling ideas about ethics and governance and the nature of human beings and the conditions of social flourishing that would shape not just China but much of East Asia and eventually the world for the next 2,500 years. This is what civilizations are, perhaps. Not cities or armies or bronze vessels or oracle bones. Not any of the particular forms that human creativity takes in a particular time and place. But something deeper and more continuous than any of those forms. Something that persists through the loss of particular forms, the way a river persists through drought, withdrawing to its deepest channel, concentrating itself, waiting for the rains to return, and then flowing again across the whole width of its bed, as if the drought had never happened. And this is why the story of ancient China is not merely a story about ancient China. It is a story about the capacity of human culture to carry itself forward through time, to absorb destruction and loss, and transform them into the raw material of renewal, to find in every ending not a final conclusion, but the beginning of a new question, and to bring to that new question all the accumulated wisdom of the answers that came before. You are very still now. The story has moved through you, like water moves through a landscape, shaping things very gently, leaving behind a residue of something you can't quite name, but can feel somewhere below thought, somewhere in the quiet where the body's knowledge lives, older and deeper than the mind's quick certainties. The yellow river is still out there in the dark, still carrying its yellow silt toward the sea, still flooding sometimes and running low sometimes, and always moving, because that is what rivers do. That is what civilizations do. That is what the long, slow breath of human time does. It moves. It carries everything forward. Nothing is truly lost in it, only transformed, only carried along in the current, changed in form but continuous in substance. The way the water that falls as rain in the mountains becomes the river that reaches the sea, and the sea that evaporates becomes the cloud that drops rain on the mountains again. And the cycle goes on and has always gone on and will always go on, long after the last oracle bone has crumbled to dust, and the last bronze vessel has been melted down, and the last dynasty has given way to whatever comes after dynasties. The river knows the way. The river has always known the way, and you are floating on it now, very gently, in the dark, under a sky full of stars, moving with the current, perfectly held, perfectly safe, going exactly where you need to go. Sleep now. Let the river carry you. It knows the way. It has always known the way.